In today's episode of Ship Talk, note YouTube, that's ship with a P, ship, as in, the thing that you do with two characters in a TV show that you like. You know what I mean. We're talking about the Miranda class. Specifically, why the Miranda stuck around so long. Because you see it in Wrath of Khan in the 2280s, and then like a century later it's still kicking around somehow. So, let's try to come up with a reason why. Because, seriously, that would be like, 100 years ago would be the 1920s. So that would be like the British battleship Nelson sticking around in active service until the present day, or for the U.S., the USS Ranger or the Lexington class carriers. Just a really, really long time, and it doesn't really make sense. And we're going to try to rationalize some kind of reason why Miranda apparently was this undying class, which Starfleet had a lot of in the period, but we're focusing on Miranda today. Anyway, before we really get into things, I'd like to mention that a while ago, by this point I mean like years ago, I did a series of videos. I think there were like 5 or 6, maybe 7. There was an indeterminate number of videos about the Miranda class. So I called it Miranda Month, which means there should be about 4 or 5. Anyway, I covered the Miranda class itself as well as its sort of variants. You can find those videos. They pretty much cover everything that we're going to talk about today, but in a less condensed, better scripted format. So, yeah, you can find those if you want. So, first I want to talk about what the Miranda was. So, what Miranda was initially when she entered service. So, Miranda, the class entered service in the 2270s, so about a decade before Wrath of Khan, which is set in the 2280s. 2283 or 84, I think, from memory, but I can't remember the exact date. Anyway, the Miranda class is a light cruiser that really sort of pioneers a lot of the features and components that become the standard in Starfleet moving forward. So Miranda introduces the design language of what we term the motion picture era. So she's sort of that initial ship. And then a lot of equipment is taken from the Miranda project and translated over to the Enterprise refit that we see in the motion picture. So, starts off as a light cruiser with early sort of planning for what would become her class dating back to the 2260s. Miranda is also built right during the period where Excelsior is having its own development. And everybody kind of knows at the time that Excelsior is the way forward. So the designers of Miranda actually incorporate a lot of stuff that allows the ship to later on sort of accept technology developed for Excelsior. So she's sort of forwards compatible or future-proofed. So right from the get-go, the designers of the ship are intending her to be basically this current generation ship that can be upgraded to next generation, because they realize that this sort of intermediate motion picture era generation isn't going to last very long. Now, it winds up lasting a good long while because Excelsior had problems and was delayed more than a U.S. defense project. But regardless, at the time, the idea was we need this new light cruiser. We don't really have any decent light cruisers in the fleet, but let's get it sort of in service quickly. And let's also talk to the Excelsior guys and make sure that this new ship can take some of that tech. I also want to mention that Miranda has more internal volume than a Constitution class, so I think E.C. Henry did a video on... first off, just go watch E.C. Henry. He makes awesome videos and is very talented. And I watch him with envy at my lack of talent and his apparent surplus. And, so he did a video talking about how Miranda is actually larger than the Constitution refit. And how, is she really a light cruiser then if she's actually heavier than the heavy cruiser? Realistically, I don't think it's that big a deal, because realistically, the mission, basically light cruiser is less of a size classification by this point and more of a role. So heavy cruisers are going out and doing those sort of big and bold missions, and light cruisers are sort of motoring about the Federation doing sort of Starfleet's normal missions of supporting colonies and anti-piracy, border patrol, regional diplomacy, that sort of thing. So yeah, Miranda is bigger, but she's also several decades newer than the Constitution class, so ships get larger anyway, so that's not really that big a deal. So next up, so in addition to the ship being sort of future-proofed, you also have to take into account that there were a lot of Mirandas built. So the class was not only very well designed and had the ability to be modified with new tech as it became available, but the class was also very widely produced. Again, Starfleet didn't have a really good light cruiser, so once they had this good light cruiser, they just built a bunch of them. And then as the Excelsior project experienced delays, that meant that ships of her generation weren't entering service because you required Excelsior to demonstrate a lot of the technology before you could introduce stablemates to the class. So that meant that you go from having this short interim generation of ships bridging the gap between the original series look and Excelsior. Suddenly you go from having a couple of designs in the 2270s that are just sort of there, but they're going to be quickly replaced. Suddenly that is the current generation. So as Excelsior is delayed, you build more and more Mirandas. So that means that by the time that Miranda, this widely produced and easy to upgrade class, is sort of in very large numbers, by the time that basically Excelsior comes around, you have a lot of Mirandas on hand. And it's now a very widely produced, shifting in my chair here, it's now a widely produced, popular, and familiar class for Starfleet. So that means that there's incentive to keep it around after this new generation of ships comes into service. And in fact, because you had so many Mirandas, you actually build a lot fewer of the other designs. So you actually wind up, instead of building a bunch of, say, Centaur class frigates, you can just have a Miranda variant fulfill that mission. So that means that you actually, weirdly, because you have this sort of throwaway class of the 2270s that lasted until the 2280s, 2290s, and was produced in large numbers, by the time that you have this new generation entering service after a lot of delays, you wind up just converting a bunch of these older ships to new missions. And that ties into our next sort of point. So, you're Starfleet, you're in this position where you have a bunch of these ships that you can very easily upgrade. A lot of people are very familiar with them. It's a very successful, well-designed ship. And now you have this new generation that is theoretically more powerful, sort of per category. What do? Well, you don't just get rid of them. Instead, what Starfleet does is they adapt them for other roles. So what had been a light cruiser is, by the 2290s, no longer light cruiser grade. So her weaponry is no longer of a standard for a light cruiser, but you know what it is it's good enough for something like a destroyer or a frigate or a scout or something like that. So you wind up having this second tranche of Miranda variants that are sort of fulfilling other lighter-end roles of mainline warship. And there's basically two phases of this Miranda variant, where the first phase, taking these light cruisers, giving them new technologies and refits, and making them destroyers and frigates and scouts and things like that. Sort of still very much mainline, very important ships, but re-rated to reflect the change in capacities of the period. So that's that first generation that lasts into the 2420s, 2430s, roughly. Then you have an entire second generation of variation that basically says, right, now these are no longer, these space frames are now quite wore out, they're not keeping pace with newer designs, but they're still useful and we still have a lot of them. So instead, let's convert them to other roles. And so now you see these Miranda hulls doing things like, I think it's USS Lantry, that was converted to a sort of medical ship. You have other Mirandas being used in other roles. By the time of TNG, they've sort of been shuffled off, shunted to these second-line roles, where they are now science ships. They are sort of surveyors, transports, medical ships. They're fulfilling a lot of these side missions by that period. So by the time of TNG, that's sort of what the Miranda class is relegated to. It's no longer the light cruiser that it was designed for, and that was the mission that it did for the first sort of 30 years of its life, from the 2270s to the 2290s. Then you had that second role from the 2290s to the 2330s. Sort of by the 2230s, 40s, Mirandas are becoming, as they get older and less capable, and the ability to refit them gets to be less and less. This is when you see the Mirandas being moved off into other sort of lighter, non-military roles. So they're becoming this second tranche of ships by that period. But of course, by TNG also, the Miranda class is on its way out. So that's why you see comparatively fewer Mirandas as opposed to like Excelsiors or Oberths, and the Oberth is a whole thing. But just because they are on their way out by this point. This is a very old design, and it's on its way to retirement by sort of early-ish TNG. So by sort of mid to late TNG, the Miranda is very much on its way out. It's been mostly replaced in the destroyer role a decade earlier, 20 years earlier, a decade somewhere in there. And by sort of early TNG, its support role has been fulfilled in and replaced by other newer designs. So the Miranda is on its way out. Now you do see exceptions. USS Saratoga participates in Wolf 359, that Cisco ship that we see at the opening of Deep Space Nine. So there are still Mirandas kicking about. But for the most part, they are phased out. The Mirandas that you see still in service are sort of very late production runs, or else ships that haven't had a lot of use, a lot of time put into their space frames. So they still have service life, but Starfleet is basically just running the ships out at that period. They're not really putting a lot of extra work into the Mirandas. They're no longer receiving mainline updates. They're kind of like an old iPhone in that sense, where your 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old phone is no longer getting the current update, the current operating system, but we'll still give it security updates. Those last Mirandas are sort of in there of, we're not refitting you anymore, we're not giving you any more new stuff, but we're still, keep you in service, we'll still fix what's broke, but you're on your way out, mister, kind of situation. And then the Dominion War happened. And so this is the sort of swan song for the Mirandas, where most Mirandas by this period are now in sort of reserve. They've been scrapped, they've been retired from service, but with first contact with the Dominion, and then the sort of Dominion Cold War or hot peace, I would tend to refer to it more as a hot peace, in the build-up to the Dominion War, Starfleet reactivates a lot of Mirandas. And what they're doing with these ships is they're very quickly updating them. So these are not sort of fully manned ships. The ships that we see at like Chintalka and other engagements, the Battle of Cardassia, that throughout the Dominion War, these are in, with some exceptions, for the most part, they are second-line Mirandas. So these are ships that have been retired, they've been stripped of any sort of useful equipment by Starfleet, and then they've languished in a surplus depot for, 10 years or whatever. Now they're being brought back online, but they're being brought back in a basic way, because what Starfleet needs is numbers. And that means that you don't need fully manned, fully operational ships. If you can instead get a vessel that has a small skeleton crew operating from a safe space. So I've seen a lot of theories that the Mirandas we see in the Dominion War are basically drones that are being commanded by other ships. I don't really buy that. There's a lot of probably interference going on in these battles, which would make communications with ships difficult. But I would definitely assume that the Mirandas that we see have very minimal crews, a lot of automation, and that basically what they're doing is a small crew is commanding the ship from a shuttle docked in the shuttle bay, and that if the ship then takes serious damage, basically they just power up the shuttle and zoom them off and they're fine. So a lot of the Mirandas that we see are basically just there to take damage, fill out the fleet, and give Starfleet the numbers that it needs to win the war later on. So that's the sort of final generation, the last hurrah of the Miranda class is seen during the Dominion War. So yeah, that is the video. It happened, I guess. Hope that you enjoyed this episode of Ship Talk. Let me know what you think about the Miranda class. If you have any theories that differ from mine as to why the ship lasted, of course, in universe at least. Really, I could have just said this at the beginning. The Miranda lasted so long in Star Trek because the film crew of The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine had access to this really high-quality model of the USS Reliant made for the Wrath of Khan. So it was just easy to use that model in the shows back when they were using practical models. And it was much less expensive than making a whole new ship model. So that's the real reason. But, that's boring, and if I see it in any comments, I'm going to ignore it, because that's a boring explanation. The real world is stupid, and I don't like it, and I don't want to be here. But Star Trek is cool, and you can, order hot beverages from a small cubbyhole, or like a whole turkey, I guess. I don't know why I said turkey. I don't like turkey. Anyway, Star Trek is cooler than the world we live in, because the world we live in is, people want you to pay, bills and stuff, and in Star Trek, they just let you really do whatever. So yeah, what I'm saying is basically, Star Trek, I want to go there. You probably do too, but this is kind of a downer way to end the video. Let's see, what else? On another note, thank you, as always, to the channel's supporters on Patreon. I wonder if the channel, because there are 3 of them on Patreon, and I wonder if they're happy that they're basically given a shout-out at the end of videos alongside this, unhinged ramblings of a very tired person. I wonder if that's something that they appreciate or not. I would imagine not. But anyway, if you want to raise that number of slightly perplexed people on Patreon from 3 to 4, there is a link that you can follow. And you can join the channel's Patreon and give me money so that you too can be given shoutouts almost as an afterthought. Oh, I'm terrible. What else do you get on Patreon aside from that? You also get, now I realize, you get a vote on one video topic a month, and I need to put that vote up. I'm going to do that right after I finish this, because I really need to do that. I think I missed last month. I'm not great with Patreon, so if you want Patreon to get better, give it money, maybe? I don't know. Maybe that's my problem, I don't know. If you are a supporter on Patreon and you're hearing this and thinking, that idiot, I no longer want to support him, I definitely get that. Anyway, if you're still supporting Patreon, we'll see next video if there's still any supporters there. But, thank you while you're still here. I guess I'm gonna go now before I do more damage.